Welcome everyone to the third episode of our podcast series, Conversations on Empathy Centric Design. And we are thrilled to have you all join us for what promises to be an enlightening and thought-provoking discussion. Today, we have the privilege of hosting two guests, Rachel Adler, Associate Professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and Bruno Oro, Assistant Professor at Iowa State University. Both Rachel and Bruno recently presented papers at the third edition of our Empathic workshop at CHI conference in Hawaii this year, and I'm really excited to learn more about their research and insights in this episode. Our focus today is on the critical intersection of the ableism, accessibility, and empathy in design. Rachel and Bruno will discuss how these elements shape the development of assistive technologies and influence the lives of people with disabilities. As usual, in the first half of our program, we will hear from Rachel and Bruno as they discuss their research and share their perspectives. In the second half, we will open up the conversation to all our audience, to you, inviting you to participate directly in the discussion. Without further ado, let's begin. Rachel and Bruno, welcome to the conversations again. The stage is yours.
So I'm Rachel Adler. I'm an associate professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And my research is in human-computer interaction and accessibility. And particularly, I design applications for and with people with disabilities. Bruno.
Hi. My name is Bruno Oro. I'm an assistant professor in industrial design at Iowa State University. My research focuses on the relationship between assistive products and services and children with disabilities. And Rachel, can you tell us more about Airplane's impact and development of mobile health applications?
Yes, I would definitely like to chat with you about ableism and how it impacts the development of mobile health applications. I'll start by talking a little bit about the word disability. It has this really negative connotation where people don't necessarily identify as having a disability because of it. And we've seen this in my research. In one of my research projects, we are working on the design of an app to empower cancer survivors with disabilities. Many cancer survivors, because of cancer or because of the treatment of cancer, they have physical disabilities or cognitive disabilities. For example, they might have chemo brain, and from chemo brain, it might make it more difficult, while reading text on a web page or app might have been something that was easier to do before. Now, the processing it is much more difficult, and some of them will want to use audio if that's available to hear what they're reading instead of reading. But one of the things, as we are designing this app, and we have a section on, advocating for yourself if you have a disability and knowing your rights and problem-solving skills and mindfulness. And when we were up to usability testing and getting participants to try it, we found a lot of cancer survivors who have these impairments, physical impairments, cognitive, but they said, I don't have a disability. And our flyers were all like, if you have cancer and a disability, and they're like, of course I don't have a disability. And it's just, this word disability is they might describe impairments that sound very similar to a disability, but they won't necessarily identify it as a disability. And we see this in class too, when I'm teaching, and some of my students will identify as having a disability and they get extra time and the support, and then some of them don't want to identify as having a disability. And so this is why it's important to be aware that not everyone who has a disability will say they have a disability. And so that's something just to understand. And when we're designing the implications for this for our apps and health apps, particularly health apps for people with disabilities, it's important to realize that not everyone will necessarily identify as having a disability. So to keep that in mind so that they're able to still utilize the skills of the app, understanding rights that people might have. So this is just a struggle that we have in general because of the connotations of have such, and maybe it will change in time, and hopefully it will. But right now we have this. Not everyone wants to say they have a disability, and so that's just something to be aware of. Now, that's on the side of like the user, but then you also have this ableism on the side of the designer, where because of it, it can lead to applications that are not fully accessible or accurate. And therefore, it is really crucial to include people with disabilities in the design process. This will help with empathy and knowing who your user is and keeping them in the process, but also with creating an application that truly meets their needs. Bruno, can you tell me a little bit about ableism impacting design in your work?
In industrial design, ableism is coordination product development, I would say. It's very, very common in the industry that designers or engineers, whatever they are developing assistive products, let's put that as an example. They will focus far more on the functionality and the manufacturing of this product rather than an empathy-centric approach, rather than like understanding the user, understanding the limitations. And that is partially a reason because everything goes super fast in the industry. We launch products that are still being developed, right, sometimes, and sometimes they have recalls. For example, we keep seeing Tesla cars being recalled, which is for a reason. We test on the go sometimes. But in terms of assistive products themselves, that is a massive focus from the industry in developing products that are just purely functional rather than something that's less stigmatizing. And this is a discussion that have been back and forth between academics and other practitioners in the area. This lack of empathy on how the design is developed, on how these professionals are developing those products. It's rare that you see a disabled designer working in this specific industry, right? And it's something that is extremely relevant. I have students that have disabled students in the past that develop fantastic products, and their focus when they joined the industry was far more towards an empathy-centric approach, where they were focusing on, okay, let's start designing with what we normally call an extreme user, to then open and broad commercially to every user.
Thank you. Would you be able to share some design projects where empathy played a pivotal role in understanding user needs and behaviors, and what methodologies you employed to ensure an empathetic design?
A good example I can give on this was last semester. I have a student doing his final project with us, and students are often put into some challenging tasks. He wanted to design shoes, and that was his core aspect. He wanted to go to the shoes industry, and he joined my research, and we started discussing the possibility of designing shoes for children with cerebral palsy that have to use orthotics. The research was fantastic. He understood the complexity of the problem, but during the ideation phase, it was interesting to see that he was designing like any other designer, obviously. He was designing shoes with some nice aesthetics, with some nice ergonomics, but there were a few features missing. And what I did on that case was to bring what we normally call the role play in industrial design. I think I use an HCI as well. And with that, he started using orthotics for 2 weeks. He's an able-bodied person, so he was using orthotics for 2 weeks daily, going to bed, getting the bus to go to the university, going grocery. And the first few minutes when he put on the orthotics, I was with him, and it was impressive to see his face fully change. And he said, "Whoa, that is far beyond what I was expecting to be a disabled user." Right? And this is something that it links to my answer on the previous question, is the importance of designers to put themselves in the shoes of the user, but exactly how the user feels. Because the main issue of this is not only understanding the user, but the user, a disabled body user, is also used to certain things, right? So they will be able to articulate all the issues they feel daily, all the challenges they feel, but certain things they're not going to see. because they're used to it. And once you get a fresh, able person, let me put it on this way, disable them, the perspective change, right? And thus design change as well, right? So you end up with a fantastic product where we've realized that actually normally the shoes designed for disabled children, they have a zipper that goes all around the body of the shoe. He realized that to do that, the curvature of that, the curve that zipper needs to do, it's quite difficult for children with fine motor skills. So we found out that possibly putting 2 zippers on each side and locking them once they are in place also facilitates for the shoes to not open, because the orthotics put some stress on the shoes. And there's a lot I can talk about this project. So if anyone would like to see more about it, I strongly suggest you to send a message and I can share his content and show more about this project. But that's one approach that I would say that's extremely relevant to use when focusing on empathetic solutions for disabled users. Rachel.
I actually loved hearing your answer and how you were able to use empathy in the design. We do something a little different by in the HCI world, and I'm in mobile, making mobile health apps. And in one of the projects I'll talk about now, we're designing a mobile health peer navigator intervention for people who are newly diagnosed with a disability, and they're transitioning from inpatient rehabilitation to community living. So let's say it's a new a person who's now in a wheelchair for the first time, and now there's tasks that might seem more overwhelming to them, like they want to go to the grocery store, and we peer them up. They get a navigator, a peer navigator, a mentor, a coach who guides them and who also has disabilities themselves, but is trained to mentor them through this process. And they'll come up with, what is your goal? Okay, you want to be able to go to the grocery store. Well, let's think about an action plan and steps to make this achievable. So the first step, and they'll break down the problem into steps. The first step is call the grocery store, see if it's wheelchair accessible, and they'll work with them on the different different steps, the strengths. What resources do you have available to you? What are the challenges? And here and my part is the design of this app, and which will also have a way that they could message each other and input all of this information. And so as we're working on this, what we're doing for in order to really reinforce this empathy approach is two different things. The first thing we're doing is co-design. So I'm not just designing with my team and my students. We're not just designing something and saying, hey, use this, but we're really designing it collaboratively with, in this case, the peer navigators with disabilities are co-designers. In the previous project that I mentioned before with cancer survivors with disabilities were our co-designers as well. So this approach of co-design really ensures an empathy-centric design where you're really working together with the users who have disabilities are really working with us throughout the process. The other methodology and approach we use for inspiring empathy is I lead co-design workshops with the co-designers. And the first co-design workshop I always lead is persona workshop. And a persona is a fictional representation of real users. So while it's not a real user, it's based on a real user. It's based on qualitative interviews. It's based on literature. It's really based on someone, and it has characteristics like you'll have a gender, an age, hobbies, and maybe even a photo, and it makes it much more real. So instead of telling my team, hey, design an app for people with this disability, it's no, look, this is, John, this is what he's going through. And our persona for this project, we had 2 of them that we worked on. One of them was John, a 51-year-old African-American man who suffered from a traumatic brain injury from a workplace accident. And this caused him to have memory issues and different challenges. During our persona workshop, we met with the co-designers who really walked us through how they would work with John. So not only did they critique what we did and improve it, but they also said what we should know. And this is how they worked with him. And this is how they would interact with him. And they also told us we had now he's able to walk alone. And they said, what does walk alone mean? If he has a lot of memory issues, the odds are he's not walking alone, but he might be alone without an assistive device. So you have to be more specific. And so we did this process in our previous project with cancer survivors with disabilities. Our first workshop is also a persona workshop, and it's really for the design team to have empathy. And there we had Liz, the breast cancer survivor, who is a mom of two. And there too, now she has body image issues and she has chemo brain and has much more difficulty, but her job is tied to insurance. And we really went through critiquing the persona with our co-designers and improving it and learning more about the challenges that Liz would face, which made it much more real to the design team. So then when we go and design it, we're not just designing something that we think they want, but we're designing something with this empathy in mind for who our user is. And using these tools like personas, like co-design, will really ensure that we understand the users, we understand their challenges and their needs. I have a question for you. What challenges have you encountered in integrating empathy into the design process?
There are plenty, and I would say the list will take me quite long to go through in a short meeting. I think it's very similar to my previous answers. I always put in the designer to understand how disabilities are, right? And one thing that I noticed a lot in terms of running similar workshops and getting designers to work for disabled users is this perception of designing products for users to help with their disability, but not consider their independency, right? We are designing products because people want to be independent. They want to do their own things. They don't want to fully rely on people, right? And that's something that many designers don't take into consideration also, and that impacts product development, right? Changing designer mindset to understand that user perspective is an issue that is addressing in the industry in terms of project timeline is one of the main issues. Things that we noticed as well on integrating the empathy in the design process. I mean, to develop a product with disabled users, we obviously have to go through all the ethical approval and all those complexities in academia and into the industry as well. And that is a bit of a challenge always. So thinking on all of that, it is feasible. It is more time consuming, but the industry needs to step back and understand that, let's say, a walker that is a tubular frame, equivalent to a chair with tubular frames, should not cost $600, rather, while a chair costs $8, right? With almost the same amount of materials being used. It's just because it is named assistive equipment. So this is something that there's a quote that I heard from Elon Musk, Tesla, again, that it doesn't cost much to have good design. And that's something that we need to consider for every disabled user when bringing in assistive products. But for that to happen, we need more empathetic approaches and likely developing better design methods that are empathy centric and that are identified as so will likely support designers to improve this aspect in the industry and academia as well. Rachel, what about you?
So some of the challenges that we've noticed is really sometimes even the word empathy is misconstrued as pity. And we're like, no, that really undermines what we're trying to accomplish, because we're not really trying to say, to use empathy in that way. And it really undermines also what the disability movement is trying to accomplish because you're not trying to say pity, you're trying to say empathy, and it's different. And the way to really get around this is really including people with disabilities in the design process, because that will ensure you have validity to design, accuracy, and also that we're showing that we respect you, we're empowering the disability community. and really trying to understand what we're trying to do is not really, it's really more understanding your user and making sure that the needs are done in such a way of the design that it really accurately represents what the user needs. I'll tie this answer to another project that we're working on, because I also work in accessibility education and teaching accessibility in the classroom. And to do that, we've designed games, web-based games that simulate how software can be inaccessible. Oftentimes, how an inaccessible software will look to someone with a disability if it's not designed correctly. And the goal is to really teach about how you should design accessibly. And one thing here is another balance that's a little tricky, where you want to foster empathy and show how this design will look if it's not accessible. But on the other hand, you want to ensure that the student understands that the issue lies with the software's inaccessibility and not with the disability itself. And so that's a fine balance. And we also recognize that it's not going to be a perfect representation of the experiences and the lives of someone with a disability. So really, for this approach as well, it's important to really ensure that people with disabilities are involved throughout the process, as we have foster an empathy centric design, and also even beyond that, so that we can show and go towards creating accessible solutions that really are accessible.
Well, one question for you. In terms of advancing empathy-centric design, what emerging technologies or methodologies do you find most promising?
What I think we're going to see much more of is generative AI being used. And we see it starting now, but I actually think it has a lot more potential with empathy-centric design, particularly as it can be used with text, but even voice for conversation. And that approach alone can help someone who is blind. Also, in our case, we're now starting the design of an application using generative AI that will help an older adult who might have more challenges physically and also visually interacting with an app. And this way they can have more of a conversational approach and an encouragement, and it can inspire empathy and use the right words to get them to maybe be a little more physically active. And I have another student working with generative AI for college students and giving them more of the emotional support that they need. So I think because it can learn and be trained on sentiment, on emotional responses, and understanding what, based on the wording that the person is using, it can really target an empathetic approach that can be integrated in technology. And I think we're going to be seeing much more of this in the future. I think it's a start and a promising start for us. Bruno, what about you?
Well, I think empathy touches a bunch of small aspects of design. It touches services, it touches products, it touches graphic design as well. And the thing, I will go to the generative AI as well. We have been using quite a lot in parametric 3D modeling with AI. And that, in terms of considering empathy also works on services, as I mentioned. So if you think developing a 3D model based on a scan of a child leg faster than what normally is done nowadays, but we are improving the process, thus improving the service, and thus improving the rehabilitation process of those people, right? And that we have a change on 3D printing orthotics as well. So we are, what normally takes 2 to 3 months for an orthotics to be delivered for a child. So the child goes to a clinic, get their legs casted, and then when they leave the clinic, they will take 2 to 3 months for them to get their orthotics to align their feet in position so they can walk correctly. Now you think a child that is growing exponentially in weeks, 2 to 3 months, it's a lot. It reached the point that they're going to use that orthotics for maybe a month or 2, and they will have to replace. And then the same process comes over and over again. So industry is evolving. Hopefully that's going to make things faster. And that's how I see empathy and technology being developed together, right? Because by developing things faster, we are reducing the impact on the user, I would say, the emotional impact that this user have on going to a clinic every single time, every 3 months or so, 6 months, to redo their orthotics, right? And considering how empathy works on that, we are in the right direction. Hopefully, things are going to get faster.
That's such a good point, because I didn't, think about that. Like, it's different when you're working with children and when you're working with adults, and children's sizes are changing much more. So that's something I hadn't thought about before. So thank you.
I have a question. You were now mostly talking about physical disabilities. Do you have experience in empathy or designing with people with mental disabilities?
Do you want to be specific with mental disability? Like, do you mean neurodiverse, or I just want to make sure we're answering it correctly.
In the most broadest sense. So it can be neurodiverse. It can be more cognitive.
In my research, I'm doing a lot now in neurodiversity. And we're designing, because part of my research is accessibility education, and we've been understanding more about the experiences of people who are ADHD or dyslexic or have autism, and how software is inaccessible for them. And generally, when you're talking about accessibility, we're thinking like you said, of physical disabilities, and you're like, okay, you need a screen reader because someone might be blind. You need to make it magnified. And so we've been looking and interviewing and talking with people who are on the neurodiverse spectrum. And while it's hard necessarily to say everyone's experience is the same, because it's not, it's a spectrum and people are different, but we are trying to come up with common things. Like, when you're designing something, remember that people with ADHD might become very distracted. So here's some things to keep in mind: simple backgrounds and, design solutions in that way. And for someone with autism, don't use idioms or weird expressions that they may not understand on their webpage, because they're not likely to get it. And they have other strengths, like their logical thinking skills are way surpassing other people. But then if you have colors, there might be too many colors clashing, that fluorescent colors particularly, that could really rub them wrong and make them leave your site. Same for someone with dyslexia. Keep things, include more images. And so I'm doing a lot of work on this, particularly with the games that we're designing to teach about accessibility. We've been expanding into this neurodiversity. We're also in the cancer project expanding to chemo brain, which is cognitive and not something people think about when you're designing an app for people who are cancer survivors and you're making a health app. Well, don't just make a health app. Remember who your user is. And if they have chemo brain, don't put tons of text for them to read, because they're not going to be able to read it. So smaller things, having audio, having videos. And so this is something that I'm working on constantly currently, as so that's my answer.
But regarding the empathy, for example, the neurodivergence, do you find that students or designers find it more difficult to create empathy with people with a mental disability instead of people with a physical disability, and how do you address that?
I think for me, it's more about that they don't know, that people don't necessarily consider it or include it. Like, if you look at accessibility literature, it tends to be overlooked and not there, or not there but limited. And so I think it's just a matter of showing people that neurodiversity is out there. And if you look at our students, you're more likely to see it now than ever. And it's rising in K through 12. And so it's just a matter of telling people this needs to be on your radar, and accessibility needs to be something that you think about with physical disabilities, but also with cognitive, with these mental, with all of the neurodiverse, with everything as well. And Bruno, I'm going to let you talk too.
No, my answer is likely similar. I would say it's more challenging to work with neurodiversity, and especially making people understand how other people think. They think differently than normally able user. Let me put it this way. I have worked in the past with ADHD and students projects and collaborations with industry, and product design is there are always ways to tweak here and there and make a product becomes a way to support a distracted user or to allow someone to relieve stress. So there are approaches that we normally use in industrial design. Currently, for example, my research is on children with cerebral palsy. And we noticed that when children go to several appointments, I mean children 2 to 7 years old, they are briefly told either by the clinicians or the doctors or the parents that do a quick Google search to say what's going to happen. But it often comes in a kind of more, I would say, more complex way of describing the procedure. What we're trying to do, we're building a series of storybooks for children that bring the explanation of certain clinical processes. And the thing that we touched the neurodiversity there is children with cerebral palsy, they know a good number of them will have what we call cortical visual impairment, which is pretty much, imagine a laptop graphic board that is not working fully well, and it works and recognizes your render happening, but sometimes it just doesn't recognize it anymore. It's not something that's predictable. It's not something that's fixable. It's not something that you can fully train. But by reducing them, and the issue that these children see is that, for example, if we have a full picture full of items in there, it's far more complex for them to focus on what is happening. So we are developing an app that, while reading the book, we can reduce the amount of items and characters in the book and change the colors to get more contrast, with the idea of, okay, those children should be able to read as well. They should be able to have their stories being told and understand how clinical processes go. So by reducing those elements with technology, we can also support them, right? And those are the approaches that we can work with neurodiversity users.
Yeah, we've seen that too with, like the sound, like on web page too, like with sounds and colors, like just like reducing all and thinking about just making design choices, having them in mind.
Thanks.
I have a question. Thank you, both of you, for this amazing discussion so far. And I really liked it that you started with ableism. I may have a two-stage question, and I'm trying to be very provocative here. So I'll let you answer it. But the question is that as we think of empathy-centric design and the role of designers in engaging with these communities, a lot of the times we come from a very normative view of the societies. I mean, of course, we are bound to our biases somehow, and that leads us to make certain decisions. Of course, in that case, learning about others, maybe through co-design, is maybe one of the ways to go. I don't know of others. I cannot think of others. So my question then is, to what extent this co-design should happen in terms of temporality? I mean, how long should happen? Because a lot of the times we see people change, and even with different types of disabilities. I mean, if we talk of neurodivergence, things emerge, or you develop a practice for it, and then it's no longer an issue, or maybe something else manifests. How long should a designer engage with these communities in these co-design sessions? Because, I mean, I'm assuming that if it's very temporary, or if there are a few sessions, I mean, of course, we don't have a unlimited amount of time, then it's also very limited amount of knowledge that you can gather. So to learn the progression, you might want to do it longer. And then the second question is that you also mentioned something about education and training of designers. So how does empathy empathy and accessibility related constructs should be then transferred to our designers so that they can engage with other stakeholders who may not be directly engaging with such communities?
I can try to address both those points. So the first one was about co-design and how long should it last? And is it, and one of the things is it feasible? Can you do it forever? I would say if you can't do co-design, then you really want to do a user-centered design where basically the point is always don't try to think you know your user, whether it's people with disabilities or someone else. You aren't your user. So you're a designer, but you're not your user. So you want to observe them, you want to interview them, you want to include a user-centered approach. If you can do a co-design approach, great. That's probably even better, particularly with the people with disabilities or the disability movement. Don't design for them without them. So that's a big thing. Maybe things will change down the road. That's always possible, but hard to know the future. But I would say even no matter what, you want to do a user-centered approach in design in general. We learned before user-centered design really appeared, we learned that you can't just design something without like human-computer interaction professionals in there, or it's not going to be user-friendly. And you really want to consider your user, and that's never going to go away. Future, past, present, you always want your user involved in some way because you always want to understand them, and that will help you with this empathy. Whoever your user is, it will help you have empathy for the user, for understanding their challenges, to really making designs that are suitable for them. So that would be my answer for your first one. And for your second one, which was on education and empathy, I would say that if there's no empathy, I think people might be less likely to design accessibly. Maybe they'll do it if they have to, like it's a law, but really having the empathy in place makes you want to do a good job, makes you realize and also this universal design element is you're not just making something, let's say, for someone who's blind, but you're making something that you do accessibly will really help more than like if you put a ramp in, it helps the person with the wheelchair, it also helps the mom with the stroller, and it helps other people too. And that's even with screen readers. There's people who are dyslexic that are using screen readers because it reads out loud to them and it's very helpful. So it's really thinking big picture. And the more you design accessibly, the more people will benefit. If you are making an application for someone with autism and you avoid the use of idioms and weird expressions, well, that's going to help someone who English isn't their first language. That's just going to help. So it's just a matter of being inclusive, and just generally we should all try to be inclusive, but the more empathy that you have, the more likely you are to want to design it inclusively, to understand it, to be accessible when you realize when it's real, when it's not just, oh, this is something annoying that I have to do because my boss or professor told me I have to do that. That's something you have to do, but you're not going to do a good job if it's not something that motivates you. And I think the empathy makes it real world, and makes you want to succeed.
Well, my answer will be the user-centric approach should be throughout the whole project. We normally break down industrial design to research, ideation phases, validation, and so on. And the user must be there. The user must test it. Otherwise, we're just going on the guess. We are expecting that solution is working, expecting that research is being correct, but without validating it. We cannot overwhelm the user, so that is a bit of a limitation that we normally put into this process, where we get the user to see outcomes rather than fully be part of every whole stage. And I think it is important for product development, and it's very challenging to do that in the industry though. In terms of academia and how empathy works on it, I think I'm currently working on research on how universal design principles are being placed into design curriculums, and we are missing it a bit. Universal design becomes as trendy as sustainable design became. And the universal design principle, which worked for the idea that every user has the same product and the same experience, is not fully applied, right? We have been patching up a few universal design approaches. So, for example, that is a shop close to where I live, and wheelchair, the accessible entrance, you have to go through a corridor on the side of the shop, while the other users enter from the front. So that is the question that there's: are we doing universal design? Are we teaching universal design principles correctly? And that brings as well design methods and creative process that we normally use in design programs. Are we identifying them with as empathetic methods towards users? Do we have clear definition? Do we have a clear description on how to use them? So those are things that we are missing a bit. And I think we're on the right path in terms of research and like create these universal design principles with more and empathetic approaches into design curriculums. My input in the future.
Thank you for the podcast, for the nice discussion. This is super interesting. I had a question similar to the one of Imanshu, but now I'm going to in a different direction. So far I had the feeling we'd be focusing. This is like a multi-edged type of relationship between, like the designers, back to that in a second, the targeted population, but also the technological interventions we might have in mind, right? Which you mentioned generative AI, but there are also other type of technology. This somehow complicates the picture in a way, right? Because the more you want to get close to the actual let's say property of the technology, especially when the technology has behaviors that are not easy to box into a canonical low resolution prototype, the more you see that you also have this new dimension of competence that creeps in. And sometimes, God forbid, you also might want to have computer scientists at the table, right? Maybe in the early phases of design too. So how do you see that, this additional complexity dimension where you don't only want to bring in the expertise, but also the empathy, and then you also start to have cross-disciplinary empathy in addition to the empathy towards the do you have a reflection on that or experience or,
I would just say, from what I have seen, you want to bring it in early. And I think people don't like empathy or accessibility when it's done late. So, I have a colleague who always likes to use this example. She was talking to a friend who's a software developer, and she said, "Oh, I hate accessibility." And it's like, "What do you mean you hate accessibility?" And she said, I finished my whole product, and then all these people come in now, because it's like what he said with the computer scientist, and then these other people come in now, these accessibility people, and they're like, "Oh, it's not accessible," and I have to redo everything. And so my colleague's like, "You don't hate accessibility. You hate accessibility when it's done all the way at the end, after you've finished your work." So I think when these conversations with all these groups start earlier, like if accessibility is brought in earlier, like we talk about with HCI designers, bringing them in earlier, when it's earlier in the process, that before you start coding, before you start, and if the coders want to be in on the conversations early, great. But if you bring in the designers first, accessibility experts, and you make something, then the developers know from the start what they're doing. It's not something that is annoying or, then it's something that's natural. And I think also this ties back to education. I think because we don't include a lot of accessibility in education, that's where we come into this problem where the developers don't know how to do it accessibly, so then it's this hard add-on. But if it was included in university education, or even in K-12, in the empathy could be done there, so then it's a more natural thing that of course we're going to be including everyone in our applications and making sure they can use them. Why wouldn't we? And I think the more it's included in education, the more second nature it will be, and then having these, so the earlier the better.
So I completely agree with Rachel. I think that early on this is placed the best, and I was going to touch the point of adding universal design principles again into the education system. the early we haven't seen a massive change on how people identify themselves as disabled in the past years. It's been changed. It's becoming less stigmatized as it was 30, 40 years ago. Right? I do believe that is a change that is happening, and this is likely going to improve the way people perceive disabilities, hopefully, and the way it's being taught in the educational system as well. And that turns, again, push back into empathy. If we want every user to be included, explanations need to be given early on, right? Even when on a high school level or early on a child's study. In university level, there is a small group of courses in universal design and designing for disabled users, which I think they're going to pick quite well in 3-4 years time, and hopefully those professionals will say, oh, I was called later on when the design was done and I have to make everything patch up everything and fix it for a disabled user. I think the thought of designing for those users is going to come early on, as long as we train people early on.
I of course I agree with your answer. Perhaps what I was looking was maybe a little bit of a shortcut, because I don't know if we can wait, for 10 years for education to pick on. And I'm a computer scientist myself, right? So also full disclaimer here, and I'm a bit worried, if you want, about the fact that we are hinging on the ability of designers to not only be empathetic towards the target population, but also towards the colleagues, and to be like an empathy transducer that needs to move both ways. And so I'm just wondering if there is not a shortcut, but if perhaps maybe there should be an intervention to be done also in order to make sure that the discourse is broader and also includes technologies, without going back to K-12 and training them for the future. And maybe that happened to you in your experience, right? Maybe you have an experience in that respect.
Yeah, I would say it has to happen at every point in time. So, and I will also have a computer science background, so don't worry. And but one of the things that we're doing is not only K-12 and not only university, but also pushing for industry to have training as well. So I agree with you that you don't want to just do it in K-12 and wait, or university and wait the number of years. But I think it has to happen at every point in place. And like you said too, even in the university setting, being aware of faculty, staff, students who have it too. And I think at all stages, we just have to be doing it now. The earlier stages and the education will help for the future, but we have to think about the present as well.
Thank you.
I had a very small question, and I'm following up on Alessandro's comment because I thought of something. And for a moment, because most of us are in the university setting and we are doing research. And often we are working within a fixed time frame because we have courses or our students have to finish their PhDs and everything like that. Beyond the fact that we have to work and we must work with the target communities who we are designing for, and we must have empathy in this process, what other stakeholders, how can we request other stakeholders? I'm thinking of, grant bodies, should award or should make it more mandatory, to make sure that anything that has to do with technologies must be following some sort of a universal design guidelines, which means that that would go into the somehow review criteria, which makes it much more likely that people are more consciously aiming for that. And this is just one example. Have you had similar examples there in US? Because we know that in Europe next year, something similar, not really similar, but a regulation is coming in place, which is the European Accessibility Act, which actually would require all products and services to be accessible to all. And I think there is a sort of a panic because people don't know how to be ready.
I think we will see more. I mean, we do see it in some states that there are laws, and I think, and even grants you mentioned, and there are more grants popping up with accessibility. NSF has one for STEM workplace, and even NIH, and we'll see much more about people with disabilities, accessibility, and even the DEI, which people are taking away, but some places are adding the A to DEI for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. So, maybe right now it's per university, per state, and but I do think as these conversations continue, there will be. I mean, we already have laws of not discriminating based on disability and things like that. So I do think we'll have a more accessible world in the future. Even if it's not as accessible as we'd like right now.
Well, I would agree with Rachel, and there are grants and funds in the US that are popping up recently. I would say it's just the time frame of how things are happening is slightly similar to what we saw in sustainable design happening. Now we are full on it, and it took us maybe 20 years for that to happen. And when we start getting, I will say, this aspect of people disclosing their disabilities more, it's pretty recent. It's something like 5-8 years ago. So I would expect that something, we're evolving, and that everything takes a while to happen in the industry, and especially fixing the mistakes that we did in the past. That goes to the sustainable design aspect, that we're trying to fix all the mistakes that we did in the Industrial Revolution for 100 years. And now we hopefully are going to fix a few mistakes that we did with disabled users and get things sorted in the next 10 years.
Yes.
Maybe I just to comment to what Alessandro also asked about all the engineers and the technology moving into being more empathic with their users. Well, clearly I think empathy is a good trait for people in general, definitely for designers, but I'm not convinced that the whole technical discipline needs to become more empathic in general, because I think everyone has their expertise. So I've been studying design teams and how they use empathy in their processes with users, and clearly, especially in design student groups, it works very well if there's if there's an opening up in the beginning to make awareness for what empathic means and how to involve your users, and then some might be more interested in having all those contacts with the users or analyzing their stories than some of the others. And also in engineering businesses, you see, some have that interest very much, and others have not. And if you have not so much interest in the holistic human side, it's really difficult to open up to become empathic. So what I like very much that there is differentiation within design teams and where this is being discussed, and not that we have to get everyone being more empathic all the time. So that's just a thought that I wanted to share.
Bruno, did you want to address it first?
I think it goes again. I think it goes on everyone's interest, as you mentioned. But let me put up one simple example. In design, everyone is taught how to draw. I think we should all get this, the basics, and then we decide what we would like to approach in the future.
True.
That's what I believe. How the world should go. I mean, the same started for sustainable design approaches. We start to introduce sustainable design approaches for every single curriculum in every single course. Even economics is focusing on sustainability nowadays, right? Programs in economics and business. So I believe everyone should have the basics, and hopefully with a small seed, things grow.
Yeah.
And some of this could be just also a wording choice, because I see in my own world, I guess, of researchers that the word empathy means so many different things. So are we talking about just understanding our users, which is in the design process is pretty standard, or are we talking something else? So I think it could also sometimes be a language barrier of, are we all saying the same thing, but just thinking of it in terms of different words? What exactly do we mean by empathy? What is empathy? And I think sometimes it's starting with the unified definition, or trying to get a unified definition to make sure we're all on the same page. And like you mentioned, it's that everyone is diverse, and having diverse teams are generally good in the workplace, and even in the classroom. And because people have different strengths, but kind of like what Bruno said, of just giving everyone the basic skills and knowing about user design and thinking of your user, and then going from there and working on the projects from there.
Maybe if I may ask, what would be your closing statements?
Empathy is a core aspect that every human being has. We are empathetic, like, to different levels, and to different levels according to the knowledge we have on and how we perceive other humans. So the more basics we give to people, the more they understand the other people limitations in business, in products, in services, likely, the more we're going to have.
And for me, I would close by saying that empathy is good as a starting point, but then we need to move beyond empathy and really come up with solutions. And in terms of accessibility and people with disabilities, solutions that work and meet their needs. And empathy is a start, but let's go beyond that and take the lessons that we learned, and not just have the empathy, but what are we going to do with it? Let's have some action, and let's make the world, the software world, the community the classroom more accessible and usable for everyone.
So thank you very much. It was an incredible discussion. And thanks for everyone for joining us today. A big thank you to Rachel Adler and Bruno Oro for sharing their ideas and work and their insights with us. And before closing, please check our website, empathich.com, to get some information about the community. And also empathich.com/conversations. You can watch the previous episodes of the conversation series. And we have talked about how important or core it is to think about and understand the feelings and needs of the people with disabilities when we design things for them. And for me, the main thing to remember is this from the conversations. When we design with empathy, we have the chance to make better tools that really help or fit people's needs. And it's not just about making things work, it's about making things that people want to use and that make their lives better. So I also want to thank you to the audience for your great questions and great comments, and also a nice discussion. Thanks for listening, and we will see you the next time for the 4th episode.